and almost best. AYP and PL221 sometimes would come out at exactly the same time. So a school would be told that they did not make AYP, but they're also celebrating, their status as a commendable but capped at academic progress, or vice versa. They would make AYP, maybe through Safe Harbor, but they're receiving, academic watch on PL221. So this is just a quick, and I know we're short for time, we have some visuals for you in the presentation of what PL221 looked like. I talked a little bit about how it was based on percent passing ISTEP and GQE, later ECA, and then percentage passing improvement. AYP was looking at various subgroups, so performance in English language arts and math that had to be disaggregated by various subgroups, and basically it was kind of those, if you miss one, you miss it all. So it was really a pass-fail measure. So the work on A through F started, I want to say it was around, late 2010, early 2011, Jeff Zaring, who was the department's chief accountability officer at the time, put together a couple practitioner committees. The first practitioner committee was elementary and middle school. There were some elementary and middle school administrators. There were a few researchers who had primarily done K-12 research. The high school group was primarily high school principals. There were also some superintendents, got some feedback from the Principals Association. And the work was designed really to recognize that elementary and middle schools maybe have, of course we all have the same goal, right? And it's, educating our children, but elementary and middle schools might be focusing a little bit more on, something different than high schools. The high schools look at things like graduation and college and career readiness. So the desire was to move to something that, looked at them differently. The early work really focused on how to integrate growth into the model. And the elementary and middle school practitioners were very, very interested in how growth could be used as a metric for accountability, which really had not been done before. Now, at the time, Indiana's growth model, which Dr. Benevetter is going to talk more about later on, was very new. It was like an infant. And so, it was just coming out, people were just starting to use it, and almost parallelly, there was conversation about, well, how does this get incorporated into, an A through F model? And the A through F was chosen, rather than categories because, it was determined that based on work with other states and looking at what other states had done, well, parents and teachers and principals understand A through F. Early on, really, is that, the perceptions of the high school group was that the ratings for a high school needed to be based way more on just 10th grade performance. A lot of times the high schools would have students coming in, they were behind in 9th grade. Early with PL221, we were testing in the fall, so they'd had those kids for 1 year. So this was looking at how do we look at high schools beyond just that 10th grade test? How do we look at perhaps putting in a measure of growth and improvement for high schools, looking at graduation rates, and looking at college and career readiness? For the elementary and middle school model, with the very early work, again, and just to give you timeline, I'm talking mid-2010 to about summer of 2011 was when I was involved with it. The focus was a little bit more on simplicity than anything else. It was, how do we make this simple to understand, because there had been that sense that PL221 and AYP was complicated. But with the committee of practitioners, it actually was, and this will come as no surprise to you and to anyone who's been on the A through F panel, was very difficult to come to a consensus on how growth should be utilized for that elementary and middle model. As of about July of 2011, which is around when I left the department, there had been some very early work on trying to translate the elementary and middle school logic into programming, coding, so that models could actually be run. What should the targets be? How should the targets be set? And early on, just noticing some of the potential challenges with the model from this very, very preliminary work was that it did seem to be rough on newer schools, schools that have been open 1, 2, and 3 years, which is where early discussions of perhaps a growth-only model for those new schools came out. But at the time that I left the department in July of 2011, there's still a lot of moving parts, and the actual logic itself, the programming, the coding, had not been released to schools. Preliminary grades had not been released because, again, this was not written in rule. Again, still a lot of moving parts and deciding how should this really be done. Still a lot of discussion among constituents. What does this mean? Is this the right way to do it? Are these targets right? Et cetera. And before I turn it back over to Debbie, who's going to kind of take us home, the key lessons that we learned from the early work really were that, figuring out how to put the growth model into, because you've sort of got you've got an A through F, you're wanting to look at kind of a black and white thing. How do you incorporate growth into that was a challenge. And so, we determined that there really needed to be a lot more work around, understanding growth and defining growth. We also determined that we needed to figure out ways of handling schools, and again, no surprise to all of you, that had weird grade configurations. Happens a lot in Indiana. You don't just have the K6 or K8 or 612, you've got weird grade configurations. That's the technical term. You have charter schools adding grades. So, it was determined that this is a challenge. There were still challenges to defining college and career readiness at the time. At the time I left the department, it was still up in the air. Well, should we include SAT? Should we not include SAT? What does college and career readiness really mean? What is this industry readiness or the industry certification? Finally, a couple other things that really just came to light early on, even though we hadn't even carried the work forward, was that implementation of the system was going to require really good, dedicated IT resources. Folks that understand how to translate business logic, folks that understand how to write code, folks that understand how to pull data from a warehouse, and perhaps even more importantly, folks that know how to translate business logic that's going into the warehouse out into the public, which leads me into my last kind of lesson learned we had was, and I don't envy Debbie and those that kind of had to carry forth the work. I went on to higher ed and got to live in the higher ed world for a while. But the communication was going to be incredibly important, whatever model was decided. Because even when we started doing some early road shows about the conceptual A through F model, there were a lot of questions and there was a lot of confusion. Really, also we had a lot of questions. Well, will this come out the same time as PL 221? When will AYP come out? And so just, people thinking of the old way we used to do things versus changing into a new way. And with that, I will turn it over to Debbie, who's going to talk about kind of how the A through F evolved.
Thank you. So from the time period Molly left off, which would be about July of 2011, until the implementation of A through F in the fall of 2012, obviously there continue to be many moving parts, some of which all of you, or some of you rather, were very involved in the rule-making process to be able to establish the final A through F rule. So many committees continued to meet throughout that process, and the rules were refined many times, to the point that I believe that when the final rule was adopted in April of 2012, I don't believe it very closely reflected the rule as it was, or I'm sorry, the original outline as it was when Molly had left in July of 2011. So obviously that presented another challenge in that previous modeling of the A through F then was no longer valid, as there had been many evolutions to A through F throughout that process. So finally in the fall of 2012, A through F rolled out. I believe initial grades rolled out in September of 2012, embargoed through the Learning Connection application to the schools so that they could get their first view of the A through F. The piece that I'm showing you here is available on our Compass website that kind of shows all of the different elements that are available within A through F. So this is one portion that you can actually see on Compass. This is the high school version of what's available on Compass when you drill in to see the data points. And then in English form, all of the data elements that are present in both the elementary middle school and the high school model. So for the elementary middle school model, they primarily include the following elements. Under English Language Arts, performance rate points were calculated. Student growth was assessed by bonus and penalties. Thank you so much, Michelle. And finally, a participation rate penalty was applied. Those 3 elements were then also used to calculate math. The overall elementary score was then 50% English language arts, 50% math. We move into high school. You can see the data elements are used for the high school. For English language arts, it's performance rate points. And I should note that the performance rate points is actually a calculation of both performance and participation at that point, because we're using the entire 10th grade cohort and not just the students tested. It also incorporates student improvement bonuses and penalties. The student improvement bonus and penalties are what we were just looking at for the bonus targets we were looking at previously, 8th grade to 10th grade, and then 10th grade to 12th grade. Excuse me. So again, those 2 data points are also used for math. Finally, we have graduation. Graduation rate points were assigned based on the graduation rate for the school. This is their 4-year adjusted graduation rate, and it's used 1 year in the rears. So for 2012 A through F, it actually used the 2011 graduation rates. And finally, college and career readiness points, using the 2011, again for 2012 A through F, using the 2011 graduates, what % of those students were college and career ready. So as Molly noted earlier, there was some continued work on what constituted college career ready. There's 4 elements that were decided upon for the 2012 or the current version of A through F, being AP, Advanced Placement, IC, Industry Certification, IB, International Baccalaureate, and DC being dual credits. So those are the 4 elements that were considered under the college career readiness. For the high school model, the initial division between these 4 categories is 30-30-30-10. That means this English language arts was worth 30% of the high school's overall grade, math was worth 30%, graduation 30%, and finally college career readiness is 10%. So by rule, college and career readiness should increase each year. So for 2013, college and career readiness has been bumped to 15%. Graduation remains at 30%. Math and English language arts have both been moved down to 27.5% for the 2013 calculations. So any questions on the current A through F model, data points used in it? Okay. So implementation lessons learned. So as Molly noted earlier, throughout the early work, many lessons learned were noted. And by no surprise, those lessons learned were also noted after the implementation of A through F. First, policy needs. There must be a balance between policy and implementation. A robust policy with a poor implementation will result in failure. A robust implementation with a weak policy will also result in failure. So again, we need to provide a full implementation for any model. Transparency and communication are key to defining, developing, and implementing a successful accountability system. Education stakeholders should be engaged in the product life cycle to ensure success. And finally, accountability systems should be independent of a school's grade span configuration. There are over 90 different configurations in Indiana. These configurations do not neatly fit within the current model definition. So again, as Molly noted earlier, they're not just elementary, middle schools, and they're not just high schools. There's a lot of different configurations. Some of the combined schools, as we talked about at the last meeting, don't have all of the high school grades. Policy needs continued. There must be a balance between statistical validity and simplicity. Increased use of data points, statistical validity, will increase the system complexity. A reduction of data points will simplify the system, but could compromise the integrity of calculations. So there has to be a very careful balance here as well. We want to make sure we have enough data points to ensure that we're accurately assessing the school. However, we don't want to make it too complex that nobody can understand this. Rules must be consistent and equitable for all schools. Employ best practices in statistical methodology. Independent data components should be calculated and reported separately to ensure transparency and trust in calculations. This was a big one that we received a lot of feedback on concerning bonus points and penalties, and I think as we go into the accountability panel's recommendation, you'll see this echoed there as well, that many people felt that with the bonus and penalty system, they weren't sure where the calculations were actually coming from. So for development needs, from an IT perspective, an accountability system must have a process for reviewing unusual circumstances and determining appropriate actions. World-class business practices should be utilized to ensure best practice. Adhere to a formal product development life cycle. including project management, business analysis, quality control, system pilot, and formal documentation. So I think this is really a key as we implement any system, is really making sure that we use a full product life cycle, ensuring quality control, in particular, being able to provide additional feedback, establishing what measures we want to check ahead of time, and ensuring that those are checked consistently year after year. And finally, adequate IDOE capacity and development time must be allotted to successfully implement the project. Implementation needs. Success of a system is dependent upon proactive support of the field with training, professional development, and IDOE internal capacity building to better support the field. So in other words, we need to train ourselves as well as DOE personnel to be able to better help the field, and we want to be more proactive to be able to answer some of these questions. To find a quality sampling plan, including a list of corporations to participate in quality assurance and pilot exercises. Final outcomes should be reviewed for accuracy in calculations, as well as compliance with administrative rule. Again, the quality perspective. We want to make sure that we actually have a full quality plan in place to be able to assess these grades and be sure that they are coming out as expected and address any anomalies that do occur. Accountability system must have a sustainment process, which allows for annual training, review for new stakeholders, system monitoring, and feedback cycle to improve potential revisions. Turnover is not uncommon, especially in schools. We do see a lot of turnover there as well as the Department of Education, so we do want to make sure that new stakeholders come on board. They are adequately trained, so make sure there's an annual training process for all stakeholders so they know and come up to speed before grades are released. And that is our history. Any questions?
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, good afternoon. It's been a long morning for you already, so we'll try and move through this as briefly as possible and get to your questions and comments and thoughts and concerns. And I know you have a lot to consider regarding this and other issues that you've already talked about and probably yet to talk about today. I want to take just a brief minute, if I may. There are several members of the panel that are here. I'd like to, you may know some of them you may not. I'd like to ask them to stand. Some of them drove from as far away as 3 hours to get here for this meeting, and just speaks to their commitment as to how important they know this work is, and looking forward to your input to our work. So, members of the panel, if you would stand and then introduce yourself, who appointed you, and where you're from. Claire, you can start.
Claire Green, appointed by Governor Pence.
Jim Snap, Superintendent of Brownsville Community Schools, appointed by the Governor.
Shane Robbins, Superintendent, Northwestern Shelby, appointed by Speaker Bosman.
Keith Gamble, Teacher, Evansville Vandenberg School Corporation, appointed by Superintendent Ritz.
Rick Patasha, Superintendent, Portage Township Schools, Superintendent Ritz.
Scott Best, Chief Operating Officer, Goodwill Education, appointed by Speaker Bosman.
Derek Allman with the Indiana Department of Indiana Chamber of Commerce. Appointed by Senator Long.
And I'm Michelle Walker.
Oh,
I'm Director of Student Assessment of the Indiana Department of Education, and I was appointed as superintendent.
Thank you, members, for taking time. I wanted you all to see just some of the members. There are a total of 17 members. And the way this all came about comes under the heading for me is be careful what you ask for. Last summer, 4 superintendents from Allen County, Superintendent Wendy Robinson, Ken Folks, Chris Himsel, and myself. We got a hold of Senator Long, not Dr. Long, Senator Long. And we talked to him about what's happening with the A to F and all that stuff that was coming out in the paper about then. Now is it time maybe for the legislators to listen to educators. Novel idea. If you look at countries across the world that are ranked with us and above us, most of their standards are set and proposed by educators. And Senator Long invited Senator Cruz to that meeting. We spent about 2.5 hours together and didn't know where that was going. And they thanked us. They took lots of notes and made lots of powerful comments, supportive comments. And a couple weeks later, I got a phone call that said, oh, we are going to create something about the Representative Bosma and Superintendent Ritz and the governor and Senator Long each making 4 appointments and how all that was going to work. And Senator Long asked me if I would consider being on the panel. Sure. A couple weeks later, I found out I was co-chair of the panel. And that has been an honor to be able to work with Superintendent Ritz in this panel. What a bunch of creative, bright educators, people who are passionate about our profession and also compassionate towards children. And that was our focus time after time after time. And there were times, folks, we had to remind ourselves that's why we're here, boys and girls. And we always came back to the focus of boys and girls, and that was important to us, and so happy with the results that we've been able to come up with and present to you today. You are part of the team. As State Board of Education, you're part of the education team in the state of Indiana. Then you go to local boards of education, you go to administrators across the state of Indiana, you go to teachers, and I'm so glad to hear you talk about, I don't remember who said, somebody over here said something about teachers and recognizing teachers and the work of teachers and parents. And also very important are patrons, those folks who don't send kids to our schools. It's very important we have their support as well, and we are transparent and we gain their trust in public education, which is another part of what we tried to do with the MOU. We've been working on this for 7 weeks. It was 7 long weeks and 7 quick weeks, all at the same time. And again, I just want to once again publicly thank the panel members and the opportunity I had to work with Superintendent Ritz. That being stated, let's get started. Panel developed the following framework of values for an accountability system. I know all of you have had the opportunity to read through this, and I'm going to go through this, and for those seated behind us and the media as well, so that we can all understand and kind of move forward in the direction that the panel went. Growth for all students is highly valued, and the schools should be rewarded for individual student growth. We talked about this item 2 time after time after time. Make sure it's clear, fair, understandable. Make sure that teachers, parents, students, business people will be able to understand what we're trying to do with the data and how we're trying to inform the public about instruction going on in classrooms across the state of Indiana. We wanted to use multiple data points, and we wanted to inform both growth and performance, and the model should be allowed for flexibility, and I think you'll see that as we move forward. Next slide includes growth for all students is highly valued, and schools should be rewarded for individual student growth. We really focused on from day one. We want to see how students are growing in classrooms across the state of Indiana from day 1 to day 180. That was important to us. Growth is to be calculated as a separate domain from performance, and growth is given a higher weight through elementary and middle schools. I'll turn things over to Superintendent Ritz at this point.
We're going to kind of tag team here. So what we decided to do was actually measure growth in 2 ways. We had a lot of conversation about not being able to see incremental growth. And in the state of Indiana, we had only 3 categories: do not pass, pass, and Pass Plus. And so we looked at other models, and in particular, we looked a lot at Alaska, in which categorical growth pieces actually break up, and you can see small increments of growth for the child. So the illustration that you have in front of you actually is includes 8 different category pieces. We're not necessarily proposing that. Statistically, we have to figure out what best it is for us to use. We do know that we need to do 5 or more. So the recommendation that you'll see a little bit later will be with that. But we're going to calculate in 2 different ways. We're going to calculate with a categorical approach, seeing students actually move from category to category, but then we're also interested in seeing that students are actually moving towards proficiency, or to proficiency. And so you'll see that little slope line on there, and I'm going to let Debbie come up. When we get to statistical pieces, I'm going to have her come up and just indicate where we are with the model and how the model would be going forward to be calculated. And you'll notice the little slope line there is very similar to the slope line that appears now in our model, but she's going to talk to you a little bit about the difference between what we have been doing and what we're going to be doing. And then we can take questions as we go. For sure, we want to do that. Do you have a question for me right now? Go ahead, Tony. The trajectory, the little line that you see, is calculated at the bottom. Okay, so it's very simple, and I'll let Deb talk about the calculation of trajectory, and then I'll also have her talk to you about the calculation of actually giving points for crossing categories. 2 ways that students can show growth and be calculated in our formula.
Thank you. So on this illustration, we're really trying to show both pieces of growth that we hope to incorporate into this accountability model. So let's touch on the first one, the categorical improvement. Categorical improvement is something that Alaska uses very heavily in their model. It's basically awarding points for, again, transition across the lines from one category to the next. So for example, you have a sheet in front of you that is a table that has a blue line through the middle of it.
This is found, I think it might be the last page in the actual report, actually.
Thank
You
you.
may even have it separately.
This is a sample of a categorical improvement.
Total sample.
Absolutely. So these numbers are completely hypothetical. Does everyone have a copy?
It's almost a page of the report.
Great. And on this report, you will notice that along the left-hand side, you have student status from the previous year. Across the top, you have student status from the current year. So if you look up a student status from the previous year, let's focus on a did not pass 1. If they transition, which is not really a transition, if they did not pass 1 in the previous year and did not pass 2 in the current year, they are awarded a points value. Basically, that is maintaining. They did not improve, but they are awarded a points value. The categorical improvement score for a school will then be the average of all of those students in that school based on that chart, or the statistically valid chart that will be created. That is one component of growth. That's being used in 2 places. Yes?
What is the measurement? Are we talking I-STEP or what? What are you using to?
Yes, so it would be our standardized testing.
This is all based on I-STEP?
Yes.
Okay.
So that's the one component of growth, categorical improvement. And you'll notice as we go through here, we're actually recommending that that be used in 2 places, dividing up that category between the top 75%, which we've retermed as higher performing students, and the bottom 25%, which we have termed as lower performing students. So again, those typical subgroups that we've always addressed in our accountability system, relabeling those and addressing those through the categorical improvement growth piece. Second piece of growth is the students meeting targeted growth. So for this, we expect to use the Colorado growth model, using it to baseline information and creating a criterion or lookup type table, in which you'll notice this probably looks very similar, and that we're actually plotting for the student each of their test scores. What this means, the trajectory of the student, is the slope in which is expected for the student over the course of the year. Very simply, calculating this percentage is the number of students that are exceeding that slope divided by the total number of students that have growth or have two data points. So very simple calculation. Is there any questions on that piece? Now, the second data point, so it's actually 2 years worth of ISTEP data. So we're looking at 2012 ISTEP in current testing terms versus 2013 ISTEP. Now, again, we don't have this model set up at this time, in that we do need to work with Damien Benner to work on a criterion reference system. We do need to baseline our growth to be able to do this as well. But when we're looking at trajectory, we're really stating that what we want, the growth that is expected for the student over the course of the year, and whether or not the student actually achieved it.
And all of this data is based on that.
Currently, yes. We do not have a vertical model across ISTEP to ECA to be able to utilize it from 8th grade to 10th grade, for instance.
So basically, all the recommendations still anticipate utilizing standardized tests to calculate growth. Are there any options to add something in other than standardized testing?
Oh, yes,
in
we
the
have other,
calculation
we
of
have
growth?
other data points. And
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to
Yeah, we're going to get to those in
understand.
a moment.
Okay.
Yeah. What we're saying is, on the actual assessments, we have 2 ways of figuring growth. In fact, on all of the data points that you'll see that we're going to be able to calculate performance, and we're going to be able to calculate growth. So if you bear with me for just a little bit, we're going to get to those other data points. Yes.
When you talk about growth, you're talking about individual student growth. Is that correct? You're not talking about school growth or cohort growth.
We're actually talking about individual student growth giving points towards the school accountability.
Right. But these are the same students that would contribute to total points for that school.
And totally individual. In
Right,
fact,
individual
every
basis.
year,
Okay.
a student's slope line will change because of their own growth,
And
their own progress.
will that individual student growth be then used back into teacher evaluation and so forth?
Oh, yes, the actual growth pieces are part of the teacher evaluation systems now. They must utilize the information as part of the teacher evaluation. So yes, that remains intact.
So in this proposed system, then that will all be aligned. That's part of the proposal, right? Direct alignment between all of these systems you're creating.
Yeah, that's really already in place, no
Okay.
matter what system we use.
Okay, I just want to be sure we weren't changing that
No.
component. Okay.
No.
So how does that work, though, what David's saying? Because the formula says all students. So you're going to take like an average of all the student scores, or how's that work?
Yes.
So essentially, if a student is at or above their trajectory, they count in the numerator of this calculation. If they're below that trajectory line, they're not considered in the numerator of this calculation at the bottom of the page, divided by all the students that have growth calculated for them. So in other words, we're defining a percent of students that met their trajectory or met their targeted growth for the year.
When you aggregate all of those scores, then the question about individual growth really isn't there, because you're mathematically aggregating kids over a certain level or under a certain level. So it's not individual growth.
True. The basis of it is...
True? Is that true?
Well, the basis of it is the individual growth. But when we're trying to look at it at a school level, we need to know how many students did achieve their growth.
But it's not going to be a percentage of the kids that passed at a particular proficiency level.
Correct. It's just whether or not they hit their growth. So this could actually be, the entire plot could be picked up and lowered into the low performing category, so that they are reaching their growth even though they're still below the pass line. Or you could move it up into the pass plus
So
line.
it's possible we have a cohort of children who aren't meeting basic competency in a particular discipline that could still be passing.
They could still be achieving the growth that's required, yes.
Yeah, we're showing growth in 2 ways. It was very important to the panel that we show growth of students who are far below the line.
Sure.
And that we actually show where they're growing categorically and see that they're passing those red lines, so to speak. In addition, we also want to see the kids are on a slope trajectory to actually be proficient. We want to, and how much do we need to catch them up? So we have to actually really make sure that we have two things in mind. We want to see their movement over categories, but we also have to know what do we have to do and how to get them to be where they need to be. It's not good enough. The panel decided it wasn't good enough just to see them pass over some bars. We also needed to make sure that we saw that we were moving kids fast enough to do what we need to do with them. The nice thing about both of these pieces is that it's for all kids. All kids will have a slope line. All students will have, you'll see their progress over categories. So it's two very distinct ways in which the school can earn reward for showing growth and actually have an emphasis on that.
Just to follow up, I hate to
Sure.
belabor
Oh,
it,
no,
but it's
no,
so
go ahead.
important, and the work that the panel has done is just wonderful, and I had a chance to talk with some of the people on the panel. They're just wonderful, competent educators. So not to criticize, I'm just trying to understand it. There has to be a separate proficiency model, right? We're just in part one of your presentation talking about growth. So the proficiency part, is that coming today, or
It
is that?
is.
Oh, terrific. So I'll sit
We're
here
gonna
for another
we're
3
gonna get
hours.
to everything. We're just talking about the little growth piece right now.
Just making sure we're still doing proficiency.
Yeah, we got a few pages to go through.
I apologize. Again, would you explain how that slope line is figured for the students?
That has not been determined yet. That statistically has to be determined within our model, the Colorado model that we have now, so that we can decide how is that slope line actually determined. So that, yes, we do have to do that. We're actually moving from what we would call a norm-referenced, comparing students around the state of Indiana with students and a norm reference kind of criteria, to an actual criterion reference slope line. And so we have to actually, we have to develop all of that and get that going. But this is individual student growth by the individual.
Sorry, that's one more question. When you did the pilot testing of this, what did you find?
So we were not able to pilot this completely because
yet.
we do not have the data in our warehouse to be able to completely pull this information. So that's part of the next steps, is to be able to move forward and pull this information. So we do want to work very closely with Damien, who will present a little more on these calculations and the appropriate measure of growth in here. But ultimately, I think overall we want to figure out how we're going to set a fair and reasonable target, and how we're going to capture that information of who is hitting their targets.
So you're going to do a pilot test, give us some coefficients and reliability, validity, and before we have to make a decision, is that correct?
When are we making a decision?
Well, we have to approve a model
Well,
here by the 15th, but we
So what we're going
also-
to do is approve the model and then pilot test it, and then see whether we made the right decision?
Right, and we got rulemaking process, to get everything put into language, and yeah, a lot of things need to happen. And you'll hear about that too, about transitions and moving forward.
I don't think there's any way possible to approve a model by the 15th, by the way.
Well, we're going to go ahead and finish our presentation.
May I
Yes,
ask real
Sarah?
quick, is it the intent, once we have that information and once we pilot test it, to continue to engage the panel in, I just want to ensure that we continue to use their expertise in making sure that once we have the actual data, it's in line with what their expectation and what we're looking at.
Most
continues.
definitely.
Okay.
And Steve and I have had a conversation with Senator Long and Brian Bosma, Speaker Bosma, and talking about the extending of the MOU and making sure that we have all that in place. As you saw in the previous presentation that Deb and Molly did, having time to do all the statistical analysis pieces to develop your model is very, very important. So we want to make sure that the panel does stay engaged for that entire piece. BJ?
You mentioned Colorado. Is
Steve,
this
I'll have you come
something
up.
that they have in place currently?
We currently have the Colorado model. That's what we have now. We're going to take it from a norm referenced to a criterion referenced
Are there any
model.
other states that are using something similar to what we are?
Actually, this
Suggesting?
combination, we are actually taking two models and combining them. So I cannot stand before you and say that any state is doing exactly this. We wanted to see growth in two ways. We wanted to reward it, and we wanted to see it as individuals. This is kind of what you see here is kind of an example of what a parent might see. for their individual student. They're going to see the student passing lines, and they're going to see, are they meeting their target? So statistically, we have to work all of those kinds of things out, but we've taken what we consider to be the best of some models and put them together so that we can see growth in two separate ways. Steve?
We did look at several different states, and I think we're at 38 states that applied for
They
the
have
waiver
waiver, yeah.
from the feds. And we looked at all of their data and what they were using, and we were quite interested in, obviously, Colorado. There were some items from Alaska. There were some items from Illinois. We played around with some stuff from New Mexico. I don't think we adopted any of that, but we did a lot of research and looking at what's happening. We didn't want to reinvent the wheel. But I think what we have as a presentation to you is kind of a hybrid of maybe some good things that are going on across the United States. And it's going to be an Indiana model. That's our intent. You ready for me? Yes. The model should be clear and understandable. We already talked about fair and transparent. As Superintendent Ritz talked about, we want parents to be able to look at the graph that you just saw, whether they can go with the transitional lines or going categories and easily understood. We'll award points for performance and growth indicators. In the current model, there's bonus points and penalty points, no bonus points or penalty points in what we have proposed for your consideration. Right now, we're in a 1 through 4 category of points for scores. The model is being transitioned or recommended to be transitioned to a 100-point scale. Yes.
I've been reading and looking, and I understand the old model is plus. I mean, do not get me wrong, and the panel has done tremendous things. But I just question sometimes the word simple and clear, because it may certainly be more fair, and it may certainly be a better model, but when I look at, different charts and showing, and we're going to show the parents this chart, and we've got to explain this, and we've got this chart, and then people talk about how hard it was to calculate the old model, and I mean, that was one of the number one complaints with the old model was, I heard over and over, it would take a PhD to understand the old model. This model, I don't know, is any more easy to explain, and I caution us in saying it's simpler. I'm happy to say it's more fair. I'm happy to say it may be better, but I want to watch using the words, it's on a simple 100-point scale, because this isn't simple, and so I caution us in saying that, because it makes it sound like we'll just be able to say to anybody, well, here's how it works.
Well, that's a good point in communication.
And I just want to communicate that.
Correct.
I mean, I'm happy to say it's more fair, but I caution us in saying it's simpler. And that's okay, because maybe to make it more fair, we give up some of that. In communicating to parents and to the public, I just don't want it to sound like this is so simple, because it's not, and that's why it takes experts, and that's why it takes time, and that's why it takes dedication to come up with it.
Yeah. Point well taken.
That word makes me, because I think about my kids and my parents and explaining it to them. And I'd rather be able to say it's fair, maybe not simpler.
Point taken. And because we've looked at it for 7 weeks and 6 and 7 hours a day at a time, it's probably very simple to us. And I appreciate the feedback, because this is some of the stuff we need to hear. Brad.
We've got fairness and I think a better concept here by the work of the panel. I'm wondering when we get to the reporting side of how we share that, how do we involve parents into saying, hey, we think this is simple and clear. What do you think? I think that's the best way to get to that win-win. I'm just wondering how we get that voice in, and we don't have to use that today.
Yeah, and you'll see some very strong recommendations regarding communication. That point is well taken. On the next slide, you have, sorry.
I apologize, I'm sorry.
Sorry,
It says there's no bonus points or penalty points.
No.
Does that include the percentage of your students that are tested?
Yes, we're going to get into all of those issues and participation and everything coming right up.
Apologize.
You all have a side-by-side. And we're not going to go through that today, but that was requested by several members of the board, and that's the first page of it. So I encourage you to look at that side by side because it really does have all of the pieces in there for you to look at. It compares and so on this page, you can see it went from a 0 to 4-point scale in 2012, and we are making a recommendation that in 2014-15 that this would be in effect. And so it says 2015 on there, and you can see that we would go to a 100-point scale. 90, 80, 70, 60, no rounding up. Okay, if you had an 89.999, you're going to get a B. All right, so that's the scale that we've got. But I encourage you to look at that side by side very, very carefully. Going on, we're going to get into the data points. Just go right through those.
Okay. No, you're doing this. Oh, sorry.
Yes, I can go ahead and do that.
I don't know where the best place would be to ask a question, but when we talk about comparatives, I want
Sure.
to ask a question specifically around the testing. So when we're there, can you?
Sure.
I know it's probably coming, so I want to wait, but if there's a
That's
better
okay.
place to ask it, if you could cue me, I'd like to ask this question.
Okey-doke.
Assessment.
We did look at multiple data points to inform both growth and performance. We decided as a committee that we were only going to have 2 domains. 2, growth and performance. And whatever indicators we were going to have to measure, we were going to put them in both categories. So we have English language arts, math, reading, graduation, college and career readiness. Now, reading is an additional data point because the committee decided that we wanted to see reading as a data point. That doesn't necessarily mean more assessment. It could be that we have an assessment going forward later on that actually disaggregates out that information, and we want to see it separately. So we want to see separately English language arts, math, and reading, and then graduation and college and career readiness, and we've actually increased those types of things. So on the next slide, this is an important slide for you. You have this also as an addendum in your report. And on this slide, it's just a sample, but it contains all the data point pieces. And so I'm just going to walk you through it carefully and probably call up Deb here at some point. The statistical pieces are not there because all the statistical pieces haven't been developed. But you can see that in the top domain, you have performance. You again will see English language arts, math, reading, college and career readiness. And so look at that college and career readiness little piece right there. We now have added the PSAT test to that area. We had industry certification, we had international baccalaureate, we had dual credits, we had AP courses, and now we've added the 10th grade PSAT, of which the state does pay for all 10th graders and is a good valid measure of college and career readiness. The vendor college board already has a cutoff for that, so it's a good indicator for us to use as one of our measures. And then, of course, we have graduation. So as you can see in this sample right here, just the sample blank chart here, that down there in the bottom right-hand corner, every school is going to get a performance 100-point scale. They're going to get a growth 100-point piece, and then we're going to be weighting it. We're going to say growth is more important than performance in the elementary, and in the high school, they determined that performance was more important than growth. So you're going to see a couple of differences regarding that. On the next page, the model should allow for flexibility. Oh, sorry, Gordon.
Why is the weighting like that? What's the basis for weighting in elementary and
in secondary?
In secondary?
In secondary, first of all, they've not ever had true growth measures. They haven't had them. We don't have a vertical scale. We have an end-of-course assessment. We've been trying to measure improvement and call it growth from an 8th grade test, ISTEP, to an ECA in grade 10. And so we are actually going to be talking about making a scale. You'll see that here in a moment. We actually are going to be suggesting that we have a total vertical scale so we can have growth. At this time, the weight for performance should be higher for the high school because they won't have all the data points yet to make that totally work, okay? The elementary, though, is just the opposite. They'll have plenty of growth information to be able to actually ascertain, and growth from the elementary perspective is valued at higher than the actual performance of the student. So right now, the actual calculations, you'll see some examples in here of our recommendations for calculations, but through the statistical process, that will vary. And we'll have dialogue on that as a panel and as a board. We'll have dialogue regarding all that.
Sarah, you have a question?
I did. Regarding the data points for grades 1 through 12, I have some serious concerns with including assessments at grades 1 and 2 and adding that in, and I'm curious where that decision came from and what the basis was for increased testing. One of the number one things we hear is there's too much
we're hearing
testing
that
in
too.
Indiana.
If-
So
if-
I'm concerned with adding more in.
This slide right here kind of talks to that. We currently have a model that is what I would call not configuration proof. Okay, and we have a lot of configurations. So let me give you an example. We have about 100 schools that are K2 with no data points. And currently, what's happening in our model, on our current model, is that school gets the grade of the feeder school. And so now we have a situation where we're giving a school a grade, and they didn't have anything to look at regarding their performance. And yet we're required by the federal government to give them a grade. And so we give them the grade of the school that those children will be going to. One of the complications with that is that you have teachers in a K2 school who are now evaluated by the performance of their school, and yet we have no data points, for that school. And they're getting the grade of the school going forward. So part of the impetus in actually making an entire system, grade 1 through grade 12, is that we will have data points, and it could vary about what the data points are. So let me give you an example. And we've made absolutely no recommendations in here regarding assessments, but let's just say you only wanted to do reading at a K2 school. Then that would be your data point, and that would be what it is that you use. So the panel isn't in any way recommending that they have all the data points. They're recommending that they have at least a data point so that we can actually really give them an accountability grade that they might have earned.
I guess that's where I'm confused, because you say that the panel's not recommending additional data points, however, everything says grades 1 through 12.
Oh, no, we are recommending additional data points for grades 1, 2, and 9.
Right.
That is true. But we're not saying what it is, or that it has to be a test that is going to, a state test that's going to do English, language arts, math, reading.
But if we're looking at growth across the state, don't we have to define what that is? I'm concerned that if we leave it flexible and if we leave it vague, there's going to be discrepancy.
Oh, yes, we are. Oh, yes, we have to decide at some point what that's going to look like.
So you're saying you're not making a recommendation now, but there will be one coming?
Oh, most definitely. But we did not want to make recommendations on assessment.
Okay.
That wasn't our charge.
Yeah, it would not have been fair for us
No.
in 7 weeks to make that determination. Let's go to David and then this side of the table.
You use the term performance, and in the past we've been talking about proficiency, competency at a certain level. Are you using performance conceptually as the same as those other terms, or have you changed the concept?
You know what? Let me have Deb come up. Performance has not changed in terms of we are going to talk about the students that meet the level. So
Correct.
performance is calculated like it always has been. But Deb, why don't you go back to the sample? There you go. And perhaps she can clarify that.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. We chose to use the term performance instead of proficiency because under this model, there's additional measures of performance instead of just the tests. So you'll notice that we actually moved college career readiness as well as graduation. So we felt the term proficiency really didn't adequately cover those two components, that performance really covers all 5 of the components. But for English language arts, for example, the pass rate, we're really talking about proficiency. And that calculation is the same.
That leads to another question on the criteria that are going to be used to create the particular score. Quality schools, there's multiple indicators that should go into making that particular judgment. Can you just review with us one more time, briefly, what are the criteria that are going to be used at the elementary and then secondary level?
So on this example, basically, we tried to break this out by grade levels so that you can see which type of data were going to be considered for each of the different grade spans. So for the 1 through 8 grade span, anything that is not grayed out would be considered for that grade span. So for 1 through 8, you can see it's English language arts, pass rate, which would be our proficiency participation rate,
Okay.
math, pass, and proficiency, as well as proficiency. Then under growth, we have each of those 3 categories as well, or those domains, or I'm sorry, indicators, and the calculations that coincide with those. So each of those 3 calculations, as we looked at growth before, it's the % students meeting their targeted growth, and the categorical improvement score for the top 25 or top 75%, bottom 25% quartiles.
So criterion like school culture or arts activities or parental involvement in the school, other quality indicators that according to research are said to be really critical to make a complete judgment. Those aren't part of the proposal.
They were considered throughout the work of the accountability panel, however, they did not make it in the final recommendation.
And why were they eliminated?
Superintendent, speak on that?
Well, I'm not going to speak for every member on the panel, but we don't have quantifiable data to be able to actually put them into calculations and actually produce a grade. There is no dispute. There are a myriad of multiple measures that we should be looking at to actually give a school a grade. School culture is vitally important.
Right. Engagement.
But we don't have measures. We actually looked amongst the states. People, you got to have quantifiable data. We talked about even data that we did have, we did own. So talk about disciplinary kinds of things. You know, we talked about attendance. We looked at all of the data points that we do have, decided that we didn't want to, you know, try to figure out what that would look like putting him within there. And so this is what we have agreed to, but you are so right. Now, if we get to the point, David, where we actually have a school improvement model for schools that is quantifiable, I think that's a pretty good measure to look at later on down the road, if we get to that point, because school improvement pieces are part of your school culture. And if we could quantify that somehow, that would be a great thing to add. But we did look at them, other multiple measures, but we don't have data that supports actually measuring them.
It's interesting you bring that up, David, because we did spend a lot of time talking about all different kinds of points of reference, and these are the ones that, by consensus, the group ended up on. Brad?
As a former elementary principal, I am concerned about the expansion of the test down to grades 2 and 1, and I appreciate the dialogue that went on with the accountability panel. I guess one of the concerns I have is I see it not just as an expansion of the grade level, but I don't know how we wouldn't see it as an expansion of the scope of the test when you bring the reading component in. And I guess what's weighing heavily in the back of my mind is I get concerned anytime we start saying as a state we're going to require in the accountability model a level of testing at a grade level, because that has unintended implications at the local level when people feel like they've got to get kids ready for that test. I know we're not making a decision on that, but I guess one of the things that's in the back of the line is we already have an IREAD 3 exam, and we've already got a concept of a feeder option. I'm just wondering, since we have an IREAD 3 exam that's given us some idea of how many students are proficient third grade, why we couldn't use what's existing, separating out for mobility, and track it back to say to that K1-2, the most critical metric right now we're concerned about is reading, and we're going to disaggregate the IREAD 3 data back, accounting for your mobility, so that we don't have to add new testing in at grades 1 and 2 or expand the scope of the existing testing. And I'm curious if that was discussed and what the nature of that conversation
We did not discuss assessments. We did discuss reading as being a data point. And as we've kind of talked about here, you know, that's a very doable kind of thing. Also keep in mind the federal government does not require the state testing kinds of piece until grade 3. So it may allow us to use a more flexible reading kind of assessment with the little ones, perhaps. That because it doesn't require that grade 3 until you give the state assessment at grade 3. So it gives us a lot of leeway as to what we want to do with it.
I misunderstand that recommendation to take testing in the grades 1 and 2 when I read the panel's report. I mean, what do I do with that recommendation? It's like recommendation 6 or something, talks about testing going from grades 1 to 11. I don't know how to interpret that, because my first reaction to that is, I don't want it to expand. I want to see what we can work with to keep it limited where it's at. We already have a dominant culture of testing in the schools. How do we do that and yet accomplish the things we're trying to do, which is give a letter grade?
And we're simply suggesting that we have some data points. And so what those data points look like is conversation for the future. You're exactly right. But we have an issue with K-2 schools, and we have a lot of them. And we have no data points to give them grades and on which to even evaluate the teacher. So we have to consider the entire gamut. We also have 9th grade schools who are getting the grade of the high school. That school, that the 9th grade schools as well, do not have a data point.
So as a sitting superintendent, would you have a concern about just simply disaggregating the 3rd grade IREAD data back to the K-2 buildings?
Well, I don't want to get into assessments right now. We actually have quite a bit
I'll step on
to finish.
probably some legislative toes and maybe some board member toes. I'd love to see IREAD 3 take a hike and leave. And we could use the 1 through the 10 or 11 model as projecting growth and getting rid of the IREAD 3. That's as a local superintendent, I think it's a ridiculous test that puts pressure on kids that we don't need. But I don't want to create another whole bounce back on that. So if you're asking me, are we testing more? Yeah, we're picking up 1 and 2 and 9, but we do need to have those data points, and it's fair to those teachers to have those data points for what they're instructing. And that was the emphasis of the panel, was to make sure that grades 1 and 2 had ownership in the grades and the grades that they were receiving from the A to F.
I appreciate the sentiment on IREAD 3. I'm lost on how throwing out IREAD 3 and adding testing of 1, 2, and 3 for multiple areas. I don't get how that's a trade. I don't get it.
I'm not saying it's a trade. I'm just saying it's a bad test.
Madam Chair, we have some other speakers that are going to, and I'm looking at the
I
time.
know,
Is
I'm
it
looking
possible
at the
that,
time.
we're going to talk about this next meeting, I think, too?
Well, yes,
And
well-
maybe we need to let you finish your presentation and
Thank
get
you,
to
That'd be
the other
great.
speaker, and so we can finish before 8 o'clock tonight.
Well, I still want to answer
I'm not
my
here
question
till 8
anyway,
o'clock.
Dave.
Actually, I'm needing to leave at 3, so I'm.
Yeah, I just still want to ask a quick question follow-up, because I agree with what David was saying about adding additional data points to the elementary school grade. I don't think that should be based just upon a test. And to the point about whether or not you can quantify those data points, I mean, to me, I think we should have a data point in there that what percentage of the parents participate in parent-teacher conferences. Now, that's something we can easily collect and quantify, and more importantly, it gives the parents ownership in those school grades as well, and I think they need to have that.
To punish a teacher because a parent doesn't show up makes no sense. So that's what
I'm
we
just saying
would.
to have it considered as a
That's
factor.
what we would. That's why we wouldn't include that, because it is not statistic. I don't know how we could make that statistically valid for a teacher's evaluation, a teacher's pay raise, to include whether a parent shows up or not. Because we all know, as we transition through schools, fewer and fewer parents attend parent.
So that basically, that type of reasoning is going to lock us into just always using standardized testing.
Most likely.
But when we get to the recommendations, you'll see that the state legislature actually says that is what we're going to be using, that it has to be the primary and majority measure of what it is we're going to be doing. So on the next slide.
That one's me. Panel recommends the following framework for school accountability model, subject to validation and statistical analysis as data becomes available. Recognize also, and this is in our report twice. We felt this was very important enough to put it in the recommendations twice. We know we're going to be asked to conduct follow-up recommendations, and we know, as I stated before in my opening comments, we still have teamwork to do here, folks, with you and with panel members, and we expect that, and we know that, and we look forward to that as we move through and get ready to present further recommendations. Then we look at, next slide, following independent, the panel recommends the following independent components. Grading scale, here we go. This is where kind of where we ended up in our recommendations. And I will tell you that throughout the meetings, the 7 weeks, I think we had two 2 times where we took votes. And this was the last time we took a vote, and it was an indication of support for the panel's work from the panel. Grading scale for the A8F system, currently a 4-point scale, will be transitioned or moved to a 100-point scale. To be more transparent, Gary, I appreciate your comments. The accountability system model will have different frameworks for grades 1 through 8 and 9 through 12. The system will have 2 domains, performance and growth. As I stated before, we're very interested in what happens to those kids, those students from day 1 to day 180. Model will allow for changes in assessments, including any new assessments that may be selected once the college and career ready standards are adopted. And of course, that's required by HEA 1427. As required by the Indiana Code, the performance for students on the ISTEP test and other assessments recommended by the Education Roundtable and approved by this group, the group of State Board of Ed, primary and majority means of assessing a school's improvement. The model will include data points to measure reading growth and performance in grades 1 through 10, possibly 11. Superintendent may talk to that in just a few minutes when data becomes available. The model will measure college and career readiness indicators in both domains of performance and growth. Next slide, please. The college and career ready indicators will include PSAT as a data point. That's a new one, as I mentioned before. We'll measure targeted growth. Targeted growth for each student will be determined annually. Model will measure categorical growth. So we're looking at targeted growth and categorical growth, and allow targeted growth to be measured for high school when data becomes available. And again, that's from your adoption, this board's adoption. Model will use improvement rates as data points for growth in 10th through 12th grade. The model will retain college and career ready goal at 25% student attainment. And the data will be multiplied by 4 to create the points and transition that to a 100-point scale. Next slide, please. We use a categorical improvement indicator for the supergroups in the growth domain, and Title I category descriptors will be aligned with the model by identifying terms that align with A to F categories. However, the panel makes no recommendation concerning what the terms should be. So those identifier terms have not been established as yet by the panel. Model will be developed to have vertical scale alignment with assessments in grades 1 through 10 and possibly 11. And the model will expand to at least 5 performance categories. The sample you saw was 8 categorical categories, performance categories, within the current 3 performance levels to show improvement in growth.
It says the targeted growth for each student will be determined annually. Is that?
I can't hear you, I'm sorry.
Number 10 says the targeted growth for each student will be determined annually. What did you envision that looking like? Is that something that the state is going to have? I'm envisioning other tests is why I'm saying this. No. How would we set those targeted growth marks? If it's not done universally, I don't know how the data would be reliable. If it's not done identically across the state, what's it going to look like?
So this is establishing the baselines using the Colorado growth model, basically setting those baselines so it looks like a lookup table. West Bruce always liked to call it a tax table. So you could look up what the student's score was in example and what they needed to achieve in 2013 to receive a certain score.
So what does that do for the kids in grades 1 and 2? And at one point it talked about, based on 2 data points, the growth to proficiency is based on 2 data points. So how is that calculated in the primary grade?
Correct. So currently with ISTEP, since we're doing testing between grades 3 and 8, growth would not be available until grade 4. So you need 2 data points, 2 years' worth of data currently. Third grade data, third grade test results, fourth grade test results, to be able to calculate the growth across the year. So in other words, whatever grades we're going to be testing, 3 through 8, the first year will not be able to supply growth for that. We need to have the 2 data points, 2 consecutive data points, to be able to create growth.
So that would be an additional test?
No.
But so then how's growth calculated, like for a school that's K2 and they test 1, 2, they don't have any growth calculated in their results, they just have theirs based on the performance?
So if they test 1 and 2, they wouldn't have any growth for first grade, but they would then have growth for second grade.
You're just using their first grade score as their growth determinant.
Correct.
So that's 1 data point, not 2 data points, though.
For that particular student, for each student, we'll need their first grade and second grade tests to be able to calculate growth for that student.
But you calculated then for them for third grade, which really then means you're not calculating their potential growth in first and second. You're telling me you want, he's shaking his head yes, and you're shaking your head no.
Let me tell you something, pay attention to the data.
Okay. Because you're saying you need 2 data points, so if you take the test in first grade and you get a test score, and then you take your test in second grade and get a test score, there's your data points, but you don't get that until you're going into third grade.
No. So when your first grade test score will be compared to your second grade test score, and you will receive growth at that point.
But you won't get a trajectory of where you should go then.
You can using this tax table idea, so you'll know based on your second grade score, looking it up in this tax table, what you should achieve in third grade. And that's what we...
Based on the 1 point then, that time.
When we're saying 2 points, maybe I should change that. That always seems to cause a little confusion. We're just basically trying to say 2 consecutive test periods to be able to calculate growth.
So you're
I think
not
that's
really
much clearer.
basing the trajectory on your prior 2 test years?
Correct.
Okay, that
What
answers.
test are we talking about?
Whichever test is implemented. So at this point, ISTEP.
But, I mean, for first and second grade, when we're talking about the first and second grade scores, what tests are we talking about?
Right, so there's not testing available right now for first
Oh.
and second grade. Again, the panel didn't feel like they could make recommendations on what types of assessments should be put in place for any of those grade levels.
So, but the model as it's being presented anticipates having a test now for first grade and second grade.
So the model as it's presented is really accommodating for any test that is to be presented in first and second grade. But again, the panel didn't feel like they could really make the recommendations on what that should be.
But there would have to be some tests, right, for first and second
Especially
grade?
considering that there's been no standards established at this point. They were very uncertain what that testing will look like.
I think that's where I'm confused.
Yeah.
We keep hearing repeatedly that there's no recommendation on testing, but there's clearly a recommendation on testing here. So I guess that's where, and I apologize if I'm missing something, but that's where my confusion is coming from. I'm being told no recommendation, but everything within the proposed plan reflects a recommendation. Am I misunderstanding that?
The expectation on this is that there would likely be some test data available. However, again, the panel didn't feel that they could make the recommendation that absolutely there has to be this specific test given in a year.
And I guess that's why I'm confused on how we approve a model that's based loosely on something that's not being recommended. And I don't mean to disparage any of the work, because I completely appreciate and don't envy those of you that worked through all the pieces of this. I struggle with how we wrap our heads around this when there's still a lot of important elements that seem fairly ambiguous.
Right, so I think when we get to the end and the transition pieces, some of that might be cleared up. Sure.
Yeah, I'm going to let Michelle add a comment here, but we're going to, in the essence of time, and Damien has a flight to catch, we're going to try and end this part of the presentation, if you don't mind, by 2:30, and then let Damien present. And then I'm presented with quite a dilemma because I have a commitment that I need to go to that I'm not sure I may ask the pleasure of the board. I am more than willing to extend the November 13th meeting and have a robust study session to start off at 8 o'clock on next Wednesday. In addition to, you can access any of us individually anytime to understand more about what we presented here today. But we're running into a time crunch here now. And so we're going to, if you don't mind, I'm going to let Michelle answer the question or make a comment. And then we're going to finish the presentation. We want you to get the basics of what the recommendations are. And then I know you need further study. I mean, like, I know that. And you deserve it. So let me have Michelle make a comment regarding the last topic.
May I ask
yes,
before that
Sarah.
also, just as a point of order, I had requested the item of standards guidance to be on the agenda. After seeing your correspondence, was agreeable to it moving towards discussion with the opportunity to lead to action. However, when I was agreeable to that, I was not told that there was an end time for our meeting. I have some concerns given that it was requested as an action item. I would still like there to be action on that today.
Okay, well, we'll try and get to that.
Okay.
We'll try and get to that. Because I'm not trying to...
No, and I understand that. I feel it's important since this has come up since July. It's an issue that I feel like needs to
The
be on our
agendas that went
agenda
out said 10 to 3, and that was, remember we switched the day on which we had this meeting. I had the 6th cleared on my calendar, and the 8th I had 2 major commitments at the beginning and end of my day, and one involved travel. So that's the conflict. All right, so Michelle.
I just want to make a clarifying point because there have been several questions about assessment. That the way that the panel designed the model is that if an assessment exists, it would be part of the calculation. But if there is not a second grade assessment, for example, or there is not a reading assessment in grade 3, it just would not be part of the calculation. So I just wanted to be clear on that, and that was another reason why the panel felt like their charge was not really about assessment. And just wanted to make sure you were aware that if there is not one, or if it's a different test, if it's not ISTEP, trying to make sure that the recommendation would work regardless of the assessment, or how many there might be, or how few.
Just make one point in 10 seconds, because I do want to get on to our speaker. It's hard to think about this conceptually without talking about assessment, because they are aligned.
I agree.
And most researchers
Yeah.
will tell you it's foolish to make any kind of decision about this without the assessment component. So I'm not putting any blame on the panel. The panel has done exactly what they were charged to do, but at a policy level, at a state policy level, it's difficult, if not impossible, to make decisions on a model without the assessment component. And I see the co-chair probably nodding at this point, right?
Which is why there's a recommendation here that this not be implemented till 14-15, so that we will have some of those decisions made that will inform our work as a panel. So you're right on, David. I mean, you're right on. It entered in our conversation every day. Every time we met.
can get right on from you on the meetings procedure, and then we'll be 100% today. Thanks, Glenda.
All right, on the next slide, we had some. Let me just go ahead. We had some unique situations that we know we need to address as well, but some we don't need to with this model, which is nice. The small schools, the current practice of going back 3 years to establish a cohort of sufficient size to determine a grade should be continued, and we struggle with that all the time. You got to have enough students in the school to actually have some calculations. So we recommend that very same thing. New schools, we have no recommendation because this model won't be dependent upon a new school. When you get data points, then they're figured, and you won't have to worry about whether you've had students a certain amount of time or not. Alternative education and dropout recovery schools. We know we have some things in progress regarding alternative accountability systems with 2 groups. One is schools that have total special education population, and other is the dropout recovery schools. So we know we have those things to kind of take a look at. And then school configurations with no tested grades, for example, that K2 and that grade 9. Until test scores are available, until there are data points, then we would use the feeder model. We have to continue using it. We have to assign grades so that's kind of a transition piece. And then also perceived anomalies. Even though we don't perceive that we're going to have any perceived anomalies with configurations in this system, we should always have in our rule a way to actually work with that if we do find anomalies and what that process might be. So on the next slide, you also have, I had my department actually prepare for you a single sheet that looks like this. And so I hope you take a good look at it later. And Carrie, to your point about simplicity, this is a 1 sheet to explain the calculation of grades for the elementary and the middle. And you will notice that there's no charts attached to this. Basically, we're looking at a calculator online, that the figures are there, it calculates it up. Behind the scenes are those charts. You know, they're really, the parents don't see those charts, and you know, it's just for the school accountability statistical piece. This is what the schools care about, which is what is on your sheet right there. So I urge you to take a look at the elementary and the high school, because we've created just a very simple, I guess I better not say simple. We've created a one-page explanation of how things are calculated once you have the data. So with that, we have some transition pieces to talk with you about, because we've had a lot of dialogue here about that. The panel recommends full implementation of the new accountability system in 14-15, as noted, and then the panel recommends that the model should be validated by various methods, including abating testing, you know, the pilot pieces we talked about, making sure that we're going to run with 2 years of data. So we're going to use the 2013 this year and the 2014 coming up here in the spring, and be able to run side-by-side comparisons, bring back information to you and the panel regarding the statistical analysis and how it's, you know, actually how it's working. The panel recommends the procedures to be developed in rule that automatically places school in review. We want to have some what we call red flags. You know, if this is happening while we're doing all this, then we need to take a look at that. When a school is having 2 or 3 letter grade jumps, either way, you know, that's a red flag. We need to see why that might be happening. Also, the panel recommends that protocols and procedures be developed for any kind of grade configurations that might not be covered. We want a web-based calculator so that they can just calculate the grade automatically. The panel recommends that the model developed and proposed changes to the model be communicated to schools and school corporations. We have a lot of work to do with that and make sure that that gets going. The panel recognizes that the model developed will be subject to federal peer review, and that's why we really focused on models that were already being used by waiver states. So we feel very comfortable with the categorical approach combined with the criterion referenced trajectory model to actually look at where students are performing. The panel recommends that steps for appeal process for the overall category placement be more clear and forthright, and we talked a little bit about that even here today in our other dialogue. So in closing, you have before you on the rest of your sheets the Grew-Sheldrick report. And so I want to let you know that there's one item not there. And this is an item where we did take a vote. The item that is missing from the Grew-Sheldrick report is the one that exempts schools from the 6th-year intervention pieces. As a panel, we decided that that was important, that still remained, but we figure we have put in what we call support systems for schools in our priority and focus schools, and we need to continue to focus on that. We were very strong about accountability pieces in this panel, making sure that we were going to continue to strengthen accountability and